Sarah Whitmore sat beside the fading fireplace, rubbing her cold hands together as the wind howled outside her small cabin. Every crack in the wooden walls seemed to welcome the freezing air, making the room feel colder with each passing hour. Winter had arrived much earlier than anyone expected, covering the mountain valley in thick snow before most families had finished gathering supplies. For Sarah, the timing could not have been worse. The shelves in her kitchen held only a few jars of dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, and enough salt to last another week. Her husband, Daniel, had always prepared for the harsh season, but this was the first winter she had to face alone. 8 months had passed since Daniel's death, yet every corner of the cabin still reminded her of him. His leather gloves remained hanging beside the front door. His favorite pipe rested untouched on the mantel, and his old hunting rifle stood in the same place where he had left it before riding out for the final time. The accident had taken him without warning, leaving Sarah to care for their 8-year-old son, Ethan, in a struggling ranch that seemed determined to fall apart one board at a time. Across the room, Ethan slept beneath 2 patched quilts near the stove. His breathing was uneven, interrupted by a dry cough that echoed through the silent cabin. Sarah reached over and gently touched his forehead. The fever had eased slightly, but she knew it could return at any moment. The last of her herbal medicine had been used 2 days earlier, and the nearest town was almost 30 miles away across snow-covered trails that had become nearly impossible to travel. She looked through the frosted window toward the barn. One side of the roof sagged under fresh snow, several fence posts leaned dangerously, and only 3 cattle remained inside the pasture. If another storm arrived before she repaired the fences, the animals would wander into the forest, and losing them would mean losing everything Daniel had worked for. The fire suddenly crackled before shrinking into glowing embers. Sarah sighed as she picked up the final dry log stacked beside the hearth. Once it burned away, there would be little wood left to keep them warm. Tomorrow she would somehow have to chop more herself, despite the blisters that still covered her hands from the previous day's work. Outside, the wind screamed through the pine trees, carrying tiny pieces of ice that struck the cabin walls like handfuls of gravel. Then came the knock. 3 slow, heavy thuds. Sarah froze. No one visited this far into the mountains after dark. Travelers avoided the valley once the snow began to fall, and neighbors always announced themselves with a shout long before reaching the porch. Another 3 knocks echoed through the cabin. Her heartbeat quickened. She quietly lifted Daniel's revolver from the shelf above the fireplace and pulled back the hammer. The cold metal felt strangely heavy in her trembling hands. Taking one careful step after another, she approached the front door. "Who's there?" she called. For a moment, only the wind answered. Then a deep, tired voice spoke from outside. A traveler. Sarah tightened her grip on the revolver. "The town is east of here," she replied firmly. "Keep riding." "My horse can't go another mile," the stranger answered. "I'm not asking for food, and I don't need a bed inside your home." Sarah remained silent. "I only need shelter from the storm," he continued. "If you got an empty barn, I'll sleep there until morning. At first light, I'll be gone." She hesitated. Opening the door to a stranger could destroy everything she still had. But leaving someone outside in this weather was almost the same as sentencing them to death. Slowly, she lifted the wooden bar and pulled the door open just enough to aim the revolver. Standing beneath the blowing snow was a tall man wrapped in a weathered brown coat. Frost clung to his beard, and exhaustion showed in every line across his face. A battered backpack rested over one shoulder, while his other hand loosely held the reins of an old gray horse that looked nearly as tired as its rider. The stranger didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't beg. He simply stood there, shivering in the icy wind. "My name is Elias Carter," he said quietly. "The barn is all I need." Sarah studied him for several long seconds before finally lowering the revolver. "The barn door sticks," she said cautiously. "Lift it before you pull." Elias nodded once. "Thank you." Without another word, he led his exhausted horse across the snowy yard toward the old barn. Sarah locked the cabin door again, but she did not return to bed. All night, she sat beside the dying fire with Daniel's revolver resting across her lap, listening to every sound outside and wondering whether she had just saved a desperate man or invited danger onto the only home she had left. The first pale light of dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of silver and blue. Sarah had barely slept. Every creak of the barn and every gust of wind had kept her awake, her hand never far from Daniel's revolver. She expected the stranger to disappear before sunrise, perhaps taking whatever he could steal along the way. Instead, she woke to the steady rhythm of an axe. Thud crack, thud crack. Frowning, Sarah wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Her breath turned instantly into white clouds as the bitter morning air stung her face. Across the yard, Elias stood beside a chopping block, splitting thick logs with powerful, controlled swings. A neat pile of firewood had already grown beside the cabin. He worked without hurry and without complaint. Every swing was precise, sending another log cleanly into two pieces. Sarah watched for several moments before calling out, "I never asked you to do that." Elias paused long enough to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "I know. Then why are you working?" He rested the axe against the stump. "You gave me shelter. This seems like a fair trade." Sarah folded her arms. "I can't pay you. I'm not asking you to." His simple answer left her speechless. Most men she had known always wanted something in return: land, money, food, or favors. Yet this stranger asked for nothing except another swing of the axe. Before she could think of another question, the cabin door slowly opened behind her. Ethan stepped outside, wrapped tightly in an oversized blanket. His pale face looked tired. His words surprised her. There was no demand, no expectation, only quiet honesty. As darkness settled across the valley, a large ranch appeared beyond a line of cottonwood trees. A wide wooden house stood at its center, surrounded by barns, corrals, and grazing horses. Smoke drifted from the stone chimney, making the place look warm despite the evening chill. "This is Callaway Creek Ranch," Nathan said. The wagon rolled into the yard. An older ranch hand stepped out from the stable, tipping his hat with a friendly smile. "Evening, boss." "Walter," Nathan replied. "This is Clara." Walter nodded respectfully. "Ma'am." There was no curiosity in his voice, no judgment, only kindness. Nathan carried her suitcase onto the porch before opening the front door. The house smelled of fresh bread, cedarwood, and coffee. He showed her the kitchen, pantry, sitting room, and finally led her upstairs. At the end of the hallway, he opened a bedroom overlooking the distant mountains. Fresh blankets covered the bed. A lamp waited beside the window. The wardrobe stood empty. "I had Walter's wife prepare the room yesterday," Nathan explained. Clara stepped inside cautiously. As she turned toward the door, Nathan pointed to the brass lock on the inside. "You can lock it every night." She looked at him, confused. "I won't enter unless you invite me." For the first time since the wedding, Clara found herself speechless. Nathan quietly placed her suitcase near the bed. "Take all the time you need," he said. "Supper will be downstairs if you're hungry." Without waiting for an answer, he closed the door behind him. A moment later, she heard his footsteps disappear down the stairs. Clara walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the last light of day faded over the hills. She had arrived believing she was entering another kind of prison. Yet the first thing her new husband had given her was a key. The first morning at Callaway Creek Ranch arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Clara woke before sunrise, confused for a moment by the unfamiliar room and the silence surrounding it. The events of the previous day rushed back all at once: the wedding, the long wagon ride, and the stranger who had become her husband. She noticed a small tray resting outside her bedroom door. A cup of hot coffee, fresh biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth, a tiny jar of homemade blackberry jam. There was no note, no knock, only breakfast left quietly for her. She carried the tray inside and sat beside the window overlooking the ranch. Beyond the glass, she watched Nathan already working. The sky was barely beginning to brighten, yet he was repairing a broken fence alongside an older ranch hand she had met the evening before. Neither man glanced toward the house. Neither expected anything from her. For someone who had spent weeks fearing what marriage would demand, the silence felt almost unbelievable. Later that morning, she gathered enough courage to walk downstairs. Nathan stood at the kitchen table, studying ranch ledgers while Walter Briggs poured coffee into 2 worn mugs. Walter smiled first. "Morning, ma'am." "Good morning." Nathan looked up and gave her a polite nod. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected." "I'm glad." The conversation ended there. No awkward questions. No forced smiles. Walter broke the silence by setting a warm loaf of bread on the table. "Fresh from my wife's oven," he said proudly. "She insists nobody should start a day hungry." Clara smiled politely before taking a small piece. The warmth of the bread reminded her of home. For the first time since arriving, the knot in her stomach loosened just a little. Over the following days, they settled into an unusual rhythm. Nathan left before dawn each morning to inspect fences, tend livestock, and oversee ranch work. Walter kept everything running smoothly while Clara quietly explored the house. She swept dusty corners, folded blankets, cleaned windows, and organized cupboards that had clearly been untouched for months. The large house slowly began feeling lived in again. One afternoon, she found several shirts with missing buttons and torn sleeves. She carried them upstairs, found a sewing kit tucked away in a drawer, and spent hours carefully repairing each one. That evening, Nathan returned exhausted after driving cattle through muddy fields. He hung his coat by the door before noticing the neatly folded stack waiting on the table. He picked up one shirt and ran his fingers across the repaired seam. "You fixed these?" Clara nodded. They looked like they still had plenty of life left. A faint smile crossed Nathan's face. "My mother used to say the same thing." He carefully folded the shirt again. "Thank you." Those 2 simple words stayed with Clara longer than she expected. No one had thanked her in weeks. The next morning, she decided to prepare breakfast before Nathan came inside. She searched through the pantry, found flour, eggs, butter, and dried herbs, then remembered the biscuits her own mother used to bake every Sunday. The first batch burned. The second turned out too salty. The third finally looked edible. Nathan entered just as she placed them on the table. He stared in surprise. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." He picked up one biscuit, broke it open, and tasted it. After chewing thoughtfully, he looked at her with complete seriousness. "I've definitely had worse." Clara laughed before she could stop herself. It was a quick laugh. Small. Natural. Nathan blinked in surprise before chuckling himself. For the first time since their wedding, the heavy silence between them cracked. As the days passed, conversations became easier. Nathan told stories about stubborn horses escaping fences. Walter shared tales of disastrous cattle drives from years earlier. Sometimes Clara found herself laughing before remembering she had promised herself never to grow comfortable there. Yet comfort arrived anyway. One bright afternoon, Nathan approached her while she worked in the vegetable garden. "I was wondering something." She looked up. "Would you like to learn to ride?" She hesitated. "I haven't ridden since I was a little girl." "Then we'll start slowly." He led her toward the stable where several horses stood chewing hay. Instead of bringing out the largest stallion, he chose a gentle chestnut mare with calm brown eyes. "This is Daisy," he said while stroking the horse's neck. "She doesn't scare easily." Clara cautiously reached out. The mare leaned forward and nudged her shoulder with a warm nose. Nathan smiled. "I think she likes you already." He showed Clara how to hold the reins, where to place her feet, and how to sit comfortably in the saddle. Whenever she struggled to keep her balance, he offered guidance without grabbing her unexpectedly. "Relax your shoulders. Keep your eyes ahead. Trust the horse." His voice remained patient through every mistake. By sunset, Clara had managed to guide Daisy around the training field without assistance. As she climbed down, pride spread across her face. "I actually did it." "You did. I thought I'd forgotten." Nathan shook his head. "Sometimes people don't forget. They just stop believing they can." Those words stayed with Clara long after the lesson ended. A few days later, they traveled into Ashwood Valley to buy supplies. The moment their wagon rolled onto Main Street, conversation stopped. People watched from store windows. Women whispered behind folded fans. Several men tipped their hats toward Nathan, but stared openly at Clara. She lowered her eyes, wishing they would hurry. Inside the general store, the owner greeted Nathan warmly while pretending Clara wasn't standing beside him. As they finished paying for flour and seed, a loud voice drifted from the front porch. Well, if it isn't the famous newlyweds. A ranch hand leaning against a post smirked as they stepped outside. So tell us, Nathan, how much trouble comes with buying a bride? The laughter from nearby men echoed across the street. Clara felt heat rush into her face. Before she could move, Nathan calmly placed the supply bags into the wagon. Then he turned toward the man. You've got two choices. His voice never rose. You can apologize, or you can spend the afternoon picking yourself up off this road. The smile disappeared from the ranch hand's face. I was only joking. Nathan stepped closer. Then find better jokes. The street fell completely silent. After several uncomfortable seconds, the man removed his hat. My apologies, ma'am. Clara gave a small nod, still unable to speak. Nathan climbed onto the wagon, as though nothing unusual had happened. They rode home beneath the fading afternoon sun. Several miles passed before Clara finally broke the silence. You didn't have to defend me. Nathan kept his eyes on the trail. Yes, I did. She looked at him curiously. Why? Because no one deserves to be treated like they're worth less than anyone else. His answer was simple, honest. There was no attempt to impress her. No expectation of gratitude. Only conviction. That evening, after supper, Clara stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. Nathan sat alone watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She handed him one of the cups. He accepted it with a grateful smile. For several minutes, they sat without speaking. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. As darkness settled over the ranch, Clara glanced toward Nathan and realized something had quietly changed inside her. She no longer saw only the stranger she had been forced to marry. She was beginning to see the man behind the name. Winter arrived early in Ashwood Valley. Frost covered the ranch fences before sunrise, and every morning a thin layer of ice shimmered across the watering troughs. Clara had grown used to life at Callaway Creek Ranch. She no longer felt like a visitor wandering through someone else's home. She baked fresh bread before dawn, kept the fireplace burning through the evenings, and even learned the names of every horse in the stable. The house that had once echoed with silence now carried quiet conversations, shared meals, and occasional laughter. Nathan never rushed their growing friendship. He simply allowed it to happen. One evening, after finishing supper, Clara noticed Nathan sitting alone on the front porch. A lantern rested beside him, its warm glow illuminating an old photograph in his hands. She hesitated before stepping outside. Mind if I join you? Nathan looked up and offered a small smile. Of course. She settled into the chair beside him. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Clara glanced at the photograph. A young woman with bright eyes stood beside Nathan, holding a little boy no older than 3. They're your family, Clara said softly. Nathan nodded. My wife, Emma, and our son, Caleb. His voice remained steady, but sadness lingered beneath every word. What happened? He stared toward the dark hills stretching beyond the ranch. 5 winters ago, a fever swept through the valley. He paused. I lost them both within a week. The silence that followed felt heavier than the cold air around them. I thought I was strong enough to survive it. Were you? Nathan smiled sadly. I survived. That isn't always the same thing. Clara looked at him with understanding she hadn't expected to feel. You still miss them. Every day. He folded the photograph carefully before slipping it back into his coat pocket. But grief isn't something you leave behind. What is it then? It's something you learn to carry. His words settled deeply inside her heart. For the first time, she understood why Nathan treated broken people with such patience. He knew exactly what it felt like to be one. A week later, an invitation arrived from the Ladies' Society at the church. Mrs. Whitmore, the bank manager's wife, had organized a winter gathering for the women of Ashwood Valley. Nathan read the invitation before placing it on the kitchen table. You don't have to go. Clara looked at the elegant handwriting across the envelope. They're trying to be polite. Nathan raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure politeness is their strongest quality. She laughed softly. Maybe they're giving me a chance. He didn't argue. If you decide to go, I'll bring you. Sunday afternoon arrived cold and clear. Nathan drove her into town, stopping outside the church hall. If anything feels wrong, he said quietly, I'll be right here. Clara nodded confidently. I'll be fine. She believed it, at least until she stepped inside. The room smelled of cinnamon tea and fresh pies. Long tables were decorated with embroidered cloths and candles. Small groups of women chatted comfortably until Clara entered. One by one, conversations faded. Smiles became forced. Eyes followed her every movement. Mrs. Whitmore approached wearing a perfectly practiced smile. Mrs. Calloway, thank you for inviting me. We always welcome new members of the community. Her words sounded pleasant enough. Her eyes did not. Clara took a seat near the fireplace while tea was poured. For several minutes, the conversation remained harmless. Recipes, weather, holiday decorations. Then Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward. I've always wondered something. Clara looked up. Yes. How does it feel knowing your husband paid for your future? The room became silent. Another woman stirred her tea before speaking. I suppose security has its price. Soft laughter spread around the table. A third woman smiled without warmth. Some girls marry for love. Others marry for convenience. Clara felt every pair of eyes settle upon her. The old fear returned. The same fear she'd carried into the church on her wedding day. For a moment, she considered remaining silent. Then she remembered everything Nathan had taught her. Stand tall. Speak honestly. Don't let someone else decide your worth. She slowly rose to her feet. My father nearly lost everything. No one interrupted. We didn't choose hardship. We survived it. She looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore. You speak as though kindness can be bought. It can't. My husband gave me respect before he ever asked for trust. She took a slow breath. And that's more valuable than anything money could ever purchase. The room remained silent. Several women lowered their eyes. Others simply looked away. Clara picked up her coat. I hope none of you ever learn what desperation feels like. Without another word, she walked toward the door. The cold wind struck her face as she stepped outside. She decided not to wait for Nathan. Instead, she began the long walk home. Each step across the frozen road cleared her thoughts. By the time Calloway Creek Ranch appeared in the distance, the sun was already disappearing behind the hills. Nathan spotted her from the barn and hurried over. You walked. She nodded. What happened? She told him everything. Every cruel remark. Every mocking smile. Every word that had reopened old wounds. Nathan listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he remained silent for several moments. Finally, he spoke. They won't speak to you that way again. You can't control people. No. He looked toward the fading light over the ranch. But I can make sure the truth is louder than gossip. She studied his face. What are you planning? Nathan smiled faintly. Something I should have done from the beginning. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The insults echoed through her mind. She stared around the comfortable bedroom that had slowly become her own. Then she looked at the suitcase resting beneath the bed. Maybe leaving was the answer. If she disappeared, Nathan wouldn't have to defend her anymore. The town would stop whispering. His reputation would recover. With trembling hands, she packed her clothes. She placed a folded letter on the bedside table. Nathan, you have shown me more kindness than I ever expected. That's exactly why I have to leave. I don't want my past becoming your burden. Thank you for giving me back my dignity. She wiped away a tear before placing the letter beside the lamp. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight. Carrying her suitcase downstairs, Clara froze. Nathan stood quietly beside the kitchen table. Her unopened suitcase wasn't the first thing she noticed. It was the letter in his hands. He looked at her with sadness rather than anger. You were going to leave. She lowered her eyes. I thought it would be easier. For who? You. Nathan slowly folded the letter. Clara. He stepped closer but stopped several feet away, respecting the distance between them. I never married you because I wanted someone to rescue. She looked up. I married because I believed two lonely people might build something better together. His words caught her completely off guard. I never expected perfection. I only hoped for honesty. Clara felt tears gathering again. I don't know if I belong here. Nathan smiled gently. You stopped being a guest a long time ago. You belong wherever you choose to stay. Silence filled the kitchen. Then Clara looked at the suitcase in her hand. Slowly, she set it back on the floor. I'm tired of running. Nathan nodded. So am I. She walked toward him. For the first time in my life, I'm making this choice for myself. A genuine smile appeared on Nathan's face. Good, because next Sunday, he glanced toward the church, standing miles away beyond the valley. We're going back. Clara frowned. Back. Nathan's eyes reflected a quiet confidence she hadn't seen before. This time, he said, the whole town is going to hear the truth. Sunday morning dawned bright and cold. Sunlight spilled across the snow-covered fields surrounding Callaway Creek Ranch, making the frozen landscape sparkle like glass. Clara stood before the bedroom mirror, fastening the last button on her blue dress. Only a few months earlier, she would have dressed with fear weighing on her shoulders. Today, her hands were steady. Downstairs, Nathan waited near the front door, adjusting the cuffs of his coat. You ready? He asked. Clara met his eyes and smiled. I think I am. The wagon rolled quietly toward Ashwood Valley. Neither of them spoke much during the journey. They didn't need to. The silence between them no longer carried uncertainty. It carried trust. As they entered town, people stopped what they were doing. Some whispered. Others simply watched. Word had spread that Nathan Callaway planned to speak during the Sunday service. No one knew why. The church filled quickly. Every pew was occupied before the minister even stepped forward. Clara recognized many of the same faces that had watched her wedding months before. The difference was no longer the crowd. The difference was her. She walked beside Nathan with her head held high. No shame, no fear, only quiet confidence. When Pastor Collins finished the opening prayer, Nathan rose from his seat. Pastor, he said respectfully, may I say a few words before today's sermon? The pastor nodded. I know many of you have spent months discussing my marriage. A few uneasy smiles appeared throughout the room. I've heard the rumors. I've heard people say I bought a wife. His calm voice echoed through the silent church. You're wrong. The whispers disappeared. Nathan unfolded several legal documents. When I first agreed to marry Clara Bennett, I believed she had accepted the arrangement willingly. I didn't learn the truth until after our wedding. He paused, allowing the words to settle. She wasn't looking for wealth. She wasn't chasing comfort. She was trying to save her father from losing everything. Several people lowered their heads. Nathan continued. I could have ignored that truth. I could have accepted everyone's assumptions. But I refused to let the woman who has brought honesty, kindness, and hope back into my home be treated like property. He held up the papers. These are the deeds to 150 acres of farmland bordering my ranch. A wave of surprised murmurs swept across the church. As of yesterday, they belonged to Clara. The room fell completely silent. The land is hers. The house she lives in is hers to call home. If she chooses to leave tomorrow, I won't stop her. If she chooses to stay, it will be because she wants to. Nathan folded the papers again. A marriage built on ownership isn't a marriage. It's a prison. I won't be anyone's jailer. He turned toward Clara. I want a partner, not a possession. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Nathan quietly returned to his seat beside her. Pastor Collins looked toward Clara. You may speak if you wish. She slowly stood. Months ago, the thought of speaking before the entire town would have terrified her. Now, she felt something stronger than fear. Gratitude. She faced the congregation. When I arrived in this town, I believed my future had been decided without me. I thought kindness always came with conditions. She glanced toward Nathan. I was wrong. She smiled softly. This man never demanded my trust. He earned it. He never asked me to forget my past. He simply helped me believe my future could be different. She looked around the room. I stay at Callaway Creek Ranch because no one forces me to. I stay because every single day I wake up knowing I am respected. I stay because I choose Nathan. A tear rolled down Mrs. Whitmore's cheek. The proud woman slowly rose from her seat. She looked directly at Clara. I judged you without knowing your story. I was wrong. I'm truly sorry. The apology hung in the air. One by one, others stood. Some apologized openly. Others simply nodded with embarrassed expressions. Not everyone changed that morning. A few people remained stubbornly silent. But it no longer mattered. The opinions that had once controlled Clara's life suddenly seemed very small. After the service, townspeople gathered outside beneath the clear winter sky. Children laughed while snow crunched beneath their boots. Several neighbors approached Nathan, shaking his hand. Others introduced themselves to Clara properly for the first time. No whispers, no mocking smiles, only respect. As they climbed back into the wagon, Clara looked toward Nathan. You planned all of that. He smiled. I planned the papers. The rest. He looked at her warmly. Came from your courage. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted from the hillsides, and green grass covered the valley once again. The apple saplings Clara planted near the porch began showing tiny new leaves. Bright wildflowers appeared beside the fences. Life returned to the ranch. Clara threw herself into caring for the land that now legally belonged to her. She learned how to rotate crops, negotiate livestock sales, and keep ranch records. Nathan taught her everything he knew, never treating her like a student who couldn't understand, but as someone fully capable of leading beside him. Soon the ranch became known not only for its healthy cattle, but also for the partnership between its owners. Visitors noticed something different whenever they arrived. Decisions were made together. Success was shared. Respect flowed both ways. One warm evening, after finishing work, Nathan and Clara walked along the edge of the property. The setting sun painted the mountains gold. They stopped beside the old wooden fence separating the original ranch from Clara's farmland. Nathan rested his hands on the weathered rails. I've been thinking. She smiled. That usually means another project. He laughed. Maybe. He looked toward the fence. We don't really need this anymore. She studied the old boundary for a long moment. Months ago, it would have reminded her of everything she had lost. Now it reminded her of how far she had come. She gently shook her head. Leave it. Nathan looked at her curiously. Why? Because every time I see it, she slipped her hand into his. I'll remember that I wasn't trapped behind it. I chose to cross it. Nathan squeezed her hand gently. And I'd choose you again. Clara smiled, her eyes shining in the evening light. So would I. Together they walked back toward the house. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Warm light glowed through the windows. What had once been a lonely ranch had become a home filled with laughter, purpose, and quiet love. The wind that swept across the valley no longer carried whispers of pity. Instead, it carried the story of two strangers who discovered that real love cannot be bought, demanded, or forced. It can only be chosen. And every morning, as the sun rose over Callaway Creek Ranch, Nathan and Clara continued making that choice together.